Welcome to Library Seminars, a platform for the presentation of ideas, research, and news in support of NOAA's mission. I'm Lisa Clark, reference librarian at the NOAA Central Library. Today's seminar is Building Climate Resilience Through Climate-Informed Ecosystem-Based Management, New Insights from the Alaska Climate Integrated Modeling Project. This presentation is part of the Ecosystem-Based Management, Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management seminar series, which is developed by the NOAA Fisheries Office of Science and Technology. Peg Brady from that office will introduce our speaker, Kirstin Holsman. Before we begin, here are just a few logistical tips to help you enjoy our presentation. If you're having trouble with the audio or visual components of GoToWebinar, please log out and rejoin us. This usually resets the software and resolves most technical issues. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the NOAA Central Library YouTube channel, as well as the Library Seminars website later today. We will also be accepting questions throughout the webinar, which Kirstin will address at the end of her presentation. I encourage you to type your questions into the questions chat box on the right side of your screen at any time. If you're interested in the slides from today's presentation, you can download them from the drop-down menu on the right side under the word Handouts. So with that, I thank you for attending this seminar and turn the presentation over to Peg Brady.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Peg Brady from NOAA Fisheries, Office of Science and Technology. Welcome to our series. I know we have some repeat visitors, but it's great to always see new visitors come. The series began in November 2017, and our main objectives with this series has been to showcase the excellent projects that are being done, implemented throughout NOAA Fisheries to advance ecosystem-based management and ecosystem-based fisheries management. And increase, sorry. Sorry about that, folks. I thought I had turned everything off. And to increase awareness regarding EBM and EBFM to better understand marine ecosystems. And again, today we're lucky to have Kirstin Holsman from our Alaska Fisheries Science Center to share her presentation. And I just want to give a heads up. Our next presentation is, as I say, we have it on the second Wednesday of each month. Our next one will be February 10th at the same time, and you can register through the library. So thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Kirstin, and thanks to all your co-authors today on this presentation. So I'll turn it over to Kirstin.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. And thank you for joining today. I'm really excited to share with you some of the results from the first phase of our ACLIM project. That's the Alaska Climate Integrated Modeling Project. We're in our 5th year now, and we are entering phase 2, which is an expanded scope on this project. And so we'll talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about where we plan to go. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, the lead PIs on the ACLIM project, as well as the growing team of ACLIM researchers and scientists that are involved in this across the University of Washington and the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. Before I begin, I'd also like to take a minute to thank the wide range of support we've had for this project over the years. And in particular, a lot of the work that we do is synthesis, and it draws on the collective knowledge from multiple integrated teams and workshops and groups across both the nation, but also the globe. And so in particular, I'd like to thank some of the integrated modeling teams in the US, as well as the ICES-PICES Strategic Initiative on Climate Change and Marine Ecosystems, the North Pacific Council, which has worked with us since the beginning of the project, NPRB, and the Bering Sea Integrated Research Team, which provided the foundation for the work that we'll be talking about today. I also wanted to include a glossary of terms. As a NOAA scientist, I tend to use a lot of acronyms. I apologize in advance. I try to spell it out, but once I get going, sometimes I drop some acronyms. And so for those who are following along and have a copy of the PDF, here's a brief glossary of terms for some things we may hear today, in case you want to refer back and understand what I'm referring to. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Of course, the impetus for this work and a lot of the integrated modeling that's taking place across the globe is a need to understand both the impacts of climate change and on systems, and in this case, marine systems, as well as scope the actions that we can take to attenuate those impacts through adaptation and minimize them in the future through global carbon mitigation. So you'll hear me refer to mitigation today, and in that I'm specifically talking about atmospheric carbon mitigation scenarios, and that's distinct from adaptation, which might be actions that we, management and individuals can take to adjust to climate-driven change. This is a graphic showing changes in sea surface temperature. This is data from September relative to a 1961 to 1990 climatology. And the reason I wanted to show this is to illustrate 2 points. Firstly, in the North Pacific, where we'll be talking mostly today, and I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but basically up in the eastern Bering Sea here in the center of your screen, we've been experiencing warming, especially marine heat waves in the last 3 to 5 years have been persistent in our region. In general, temperatures globally for sea surface temperatures have been increasing, and you can see this very distinctly when we look at the global mean sea surface temperatures over time. So this ranges in the graphic on the right from 1880 through 2020. We anticipate that this warming that we're experiencing will continue going forward to some degree, and the magnitude of warming depends in the projections on the level of global atmospheric carbon mitigation that as a collective across nations that we contribute. And so that's one of the things and the goals of the IPCC effort is to try to understand what the implications and risks associated with those future scenarios entail. And we'll talk a bit more about the details of those scenarios. Those projections are based upon a series of global circulation models, so coupled atmospheric and ocean circulation models at the global scale that are projected forward under some set scenarios. And that is coordinated through the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, also known as CMIP. CMIP produces these collective coordinated projections, and they renew them every approximately 5 to 7 years, and they form the underpinning for the IPCC assessments. So what I'm showing here is the latest CMIP projections, CMIP 6, phase 6, and this is anomalies under SST 585, which is a fossil fuel scenario going forward. And this is anomalies of 2030 to 2060 relative to a 1955 to 1984 baseline. The main thing here is to point out, as if you think back to the previous slide about our current anomalies, we anticipate to continue to see warm anomalies in the North Pacific, especially, and in the Arctic. And then as we sort of march forward in time and projections, so here we are at 2050 to 2080, and now end of century, we can see that warming continues in these projections going forward. This projected warming is associated with a number of risks in the marine realm, in the work that we specifically are looking at through ACLIM. These anomalies are associated with changes in fish biomass and changes in access to marine sources of protein and nutrients. So this is an issue for future global food security. Of course, if we're impacting our food resources and marine sources of protein, that could have impacts on future food security. But even perhaps of more concern is the source of essential fatty acids and DHA macronutrients that are extremely vital to children and women of childbearing age. A lot of the sources for these macronutrients come from the marine environment and from cold water species like those in the North Pacific. These changes are projected to be fairly large. The risks vary depending on scenarios of mitigation and the actions we employ to adapt and attenuate those changes. But one of the things that's emerged as a central theme is that failing to account for these or failing to plan for these is likely to lead to unintended consequences. So being in a purely reactionary mode has trade-offs that may not be the ones that we want to be employing. So to address this, there's been a number of different recent studies and evaluations that have looked at options and actions that can be taken and planned for ahead of time and evaluated in order to understand who should be participating in discussions about trade-offs and what sorts of actions can be employed and how soon they need to be sort of deployed. And so this is a series of figures from two different papers. On the left is Gattuso's 2015 paper, and I like this one. It's generally talking about actions that can be taken in the marine environment to mitigate, protect, adapt, and repair in response to climate-driven change. And we won't, in today's talk, be talking too much about mitigation, but there are some co-benefits of certain adaptation actions like conserving marsh areas, for example, or rebuilding oyster reefs that have co-benefits for global mitigation. But most of what we'll be talking about today and the focus of the ACLIM project is focused on adaptation measures and conservation measures and rebuilding plans. And on the right is Melissa Karp's 2019 central figure from her paper, where she talks about the specifics of some of the climate-ready management actions that can be employed for fisheries management. And these include things like climate-informed stock assessments, short-term forecasts of environmental conditions, whether or not there will be low oxygen, spatial distributions, whether or not there will be increased marine heat waves and temperatures in the upcoming years. Those sorts of bits of information go a long ways towards helping us adapt in real time. The other thing to consider when we talk about how management can facilitate adaptation is that it's not a binary discussion about whether or not you have adaptation or not, or management or not. Management occurs at various scales. It's often nested, and addressing a portfolio of climate-ready management advice is really critical to ensuring both near-term and long-term responses are synergistic and promote long-term resilience. So an example of this really comes into play, especially in ecosystem-based management, where things like fixed management measures, which are intentionally designed to be to impart stability over time. They tend to be fixed in time or space. So you might have something like a marine protected area, for example, and making sure that these are resilient and will perform well under climate change is an important part of ensuring that they continue to provide the benefits that they were designed to impart. Similarly, as if you kind of go to an intermediate scale of space and time, something like annual or biannual stock assessments, bringing in climate-informed information, even covariates perhaps into some of these stock assessment methods can help improve their application under shifting climate conditions. And then finally, there's been a lot of research in the last 10 years or so around dynamic ocean management, and that these are really responsive tools, nowcasts, real-time forecasts of real-time casts of conditions in a marine environment. A good example of this is EcoCast or Whale Watch along the west coast of the U.S. and the California Current. These products provide, for example, use sea surface temperature to provide maps of bycatch risk or entanglement risk for whales, and then allows fishers and fisheries to avoid those high-risk areas. So it's enabling action at the individual level all the way up to making sure our fixed management measures are adaptive and resilient. In terms of adaptation too, we can think in sort of two different realms. And this is really a continuum, but at each end of the continuum, you might have something like an incremental adaptation. And these are often adaptation measures that we individually or as a society might employ to maintain the current state of economic livelihoods, ecosystem conditions, and populations. At the other end of the spectrum, there can be also opportunities for transformational adaptation to address underlying structural inequities in the system, promote equitable responses, and ensure that some of the climate impacts, which do disproportionately impact those in our societies with less resources to adapt. So these transformational adaptation actions can help ensure that there isn't marginalization and continued impacts under climate change. The way that this sort of translates in scenario planning is testing new and existing tools and really building the capacity and the process to continuously reevaluate and enable adaptation that is equitable and bring multiple voices into those discussions. So that sounds great, but it can be really hard to implement in practice. There are challenges with evaluating adaptation options that center around the fact that it's very difficult for people in general to envision these long time horizons. In the abstract, it sounds fine. Try to translate that into things that you do today that will impact things 100 years from now. It becomes sometimes difficult to conceptualize. There's also shifting baselines in risk. Our risk tolerance changes over time, it's mutable. And there's uncertainty around the climate hazards, how bad will it be? And that all is related to our own experiences. Assessing attribution of climate change to a risk or an impact has historically been a little bit challenging when you move beyond the climate physics into the biological realm, although unfortunately, because of some of the recent events, attribution is increasingly clear in marine, especially in marine environments, to biological responses to climate change. So we're seeing more and more the fingerprint of climate change in the changing environments around us. And then addressing these sort of counterfactual scenarios can sometimes be difficult. All of these things have been shown to be easier if you use a scenario-based approach. So an approach where you use mixed methods, you have different conceptualizations of the system, and you use participation and mutual learning with those that will be taking up the information you're producing in order to alleviate these some of these challenges that arise. And so that's something that we've done with ACLIM. We've employed a repeated engagement approach. We frequently speak with our council and have had back and forth about the direction of the prioritization of the questions that we're asking. We're hoping to expand this in ACLIM Phase 2 to improve the information that we learn and also deliver to coastal communities. So this is an overview schematic of the ACLIM project in a nutshell. You can see this in more detail in Anne Hollowitt's 2020 Frontiers in Marine Science paper. And the general idea is to use global climate models at the global scale and downscale them to high resolution regional oceanographic models. We then query those oceanographic models for indices and couple those into biological models that are also dynamically coupled to social and economic models. This work builds on, we didn't pioneer this, it's a synthesis approach that builds on a lot of the science that has been taking place at the center for some time. So the models that are included in the ACLIM draw on a series of surveys and research projects and knowledge sources across the system. It's linked in and leveraging existing projects that are ongoing that are coupling climate to things like spawning biomass or northern fur seal populations. And the idea is to synthesize that, coordinate that, run some standardized management scenarios, and then deliver that information in a systematic and operational capacity to managers and stakeholders in the region, as well as national initiatives and global initiatives. So there's really 6 integrated focal components that range from this high resolution ocean modeling all the way up through an ensemble evaluation. We've integrated closely with our management system in the development of the questions and the products that we're producing. And then finally, a number of us are directly involved with multiple national and international strategic initiatives on climate. So the first part I want to talk about is the downscaling, and this has emerged as a critical step to what we do in the North Pacific, and I want to explain why we go through the effort to do this and why this is an important thing to operationalize going forward. The basis for the downscaling is a ROMS MPZ model. This is a high-resolution oceanographic and nutrient phytoplankton zooplankton model. The one that we used for ACLIM Phase 1 was a 10 depth layers, 10-kilometer grid. As you can see here, we were able to replicate our regular surveys in that system in time and space. And so we were able to do some validation work based on observations of the system. And then we'll talk about, at the very end of the talk, the expansion of this now to a 30-layer model, which resolves some of the mixed layer depth dynamics and circulation dynamics in a bit better detail. This model does a very good job of replicating things like sea surface and bottom temperature in the Bering Sea. So on the right, you can see the correlations between observations and the model, which are red, which means it's high correlation. And the reason that this is important is that we have certain oceanographic features that are key in the system to driving biological processes and their indicators of biological processes. So this is a seasonally sea ice driven system. In the winter, sea ice forms over the Bering Sea. And in the summer, we see sort of a fingerprint, a thumbprint of where that sea ice was in a feature we call the cold pool. This is an extremely cold, dense pool of water that persists over the Bering Sea shelf through the summer and is determined by the extent and the timing of the sea ice melt in the spring. This feature shows up in our survey. So here's a warm year at the top row and sort of a cooler year in the bottom row. Observations are on the left here. And it's replicated coarsely in the global climate model. So we see that it's warmer and cooler, but we don't see the specifics of the extent of that cold pool. And the ROMS MPZ model, which is the high resolution downscaled version where the boundary conditions are driven by the global model, we do see that we're able to replicate this cold pool feature. And that's important because the cold pool is both an indicator of productivity, zooplankton biomass, for example, and the timing of the spring bloom, but it's also itself an ephemeral habitat. Some species enter the cold pool, others don't, and so it can affect things like predator and prey overlap. It can affect the actual distribution of the species. And so when we link these to fishing models, it's important to understand the distribution based on the cold pool. With that model, we then query it for either annual or spatial indices that we can couple with our suite of coupled biological and socioeconomic models. We have a suite of models in ACLIM. We're using a multi-model approach and with an eventual goal of an ensemble approach. And the idea is to evaluate the uncertainty associated with the structural assumptions of each of these models. So how we can envision that there may be multiple hypotheses for how climate is linked to biology and how biological species are interacting with one another. And using this multi-model approach allows us to evaluate the sensitivity of those assumptions. So on one end of the spectrum, we have climate-enhanced single species models. These are analogous to the stock assessment models currently used to set harvest quota for the system. We have multi-species climate-enhanced models, multi-species foodweb models, and then fully coupled space and time end-to-end models and individual base models. These are all linked dynamically to socioeconomic models of harvest and catch. This is important to do because some of the assumptions that we make sometimes as biologists about what people do are not correct, and the actions of fishers and people in the system has a huge impact, as you might imagine, on the trajectory and projection. So it's extremely important to account for this. Luckily, we have a number of talented social and economic modelers in the group, and this is a nice paper by Alan Haney and Lisa Pfeiffer in 2013, which illustrates the importance of modeling and understanding the social and economic dynamics in the system and bringing that in, rather than tacking it onto the end, but bringing it into the dynamic projections. And so this is a paper where they looked at the distribution of fish in response to the cold pool, and then fisheries, and not surprisingly, fisheries don't always follow fish exactly. People make decisions about where they're going to fish, what they're going to fish in a given year based on things like the economic value of the resource and other potential options in the fishery realm that year. So modeling environmental, biological, and also harvest dynamics is extremely important to do. And in this, we mentioned previously that we are considering nested scales of management. Well, the nice thing about this approach is that we can deconstruct those management into the individual parts and evaluate the sensitivity of each individual tool towards the outcome of the projection. So this way we can identify, is it the aggregate of management actions that's needed, or is it an individual thing that's really driving sustainability of the resource? And this becomes really important as we go forward in identifying those things that are missing from a potential portfolio of climate-ready management, as well as those things that need to be preserved and may be under increasing pressure as stocks continue to react to climate-driven changes. We do this through a management scenario approach where we drive a biological model with climate that's linked into a harvest approach and a management model, and then that management model is also linked to a coupled Fisher model, and that then determines catch in an annual loop. And so in each phase of this, you can imagine you can introduce some sources of error and look at the sensitivity of outcomes. But you can also introduce adaptation measures and look at the potential response. And the end goal is to be able to describe not only the trajectories of where the system might be going under different management options, but also the uncertainty or certainty around those trajectories. Okay, so with that, now I'm going to transition to showing you some of the results of ACLIM 1.0. And the first thing I want to talk about is the downscaled climate modeling. So for this, of course, I mentioned the CMIP, the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. This is now up to something like 40 plus different modeling entities across the globe that each have a global climate model and produce these coordinated projections. And so what Al Herman and, I should just mention that these projections, these carbon emissions scenarios are standardized across the CMIP group. And they're not, they are prescriptive, plausible descriptions of how the future may evolve, but there's not a likelihood or preference associated with each of these. The idea is to say, if the world evolves in this manner, what is the risk associated? What is the climate-driven change associated with? And if these other measures are employed, or we go this general direction if humanity goes this other direction, what are the potential outcomes? And whether or not those are preferred or can be employed is really up to the policymakers. The idea is to provide the science underpinnings for those policy decisions. So to do this, there's a coordinated group of individuals that have been working on these shared socioeconomic pathways or SSPs. They include sort of descriptive storylines around sustainability or fossil fuel development. Those have policies that are sort of consistent with those storylines and changes in land cover that are consistent with them. And so those provide projections of things like cropland and forest cover that then feed back into the global climate models. And those eventually then influence atmospheric greenhouse gases and the radiative forcing that's associated with each projection scenario. And so from that, then there are a set of outputs, things like changes in global mean temperature, changes in ocean acidification, changes in rainfall that we can take up and use to understand impacts on biological and socioeconomic resources. A couple of things to note is that in analyses of these different climate forcing scenarios, these RCPs, so it's going to get a little bit acronymy here, and I'm sorry for that in advance, but RCP 2.6, for example, is associated with a higher probability of meeting Paris Accord targets of less than 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees warming over pre-industrial temperatures. And some of these higher carbon emission scenarios have a much lower probability of meeting those targets. Similarly, when these have been coupled to global analyses of ocean biomass, the fossil fuel scenario, for example, which is here, it's SSP 5, RCP 8.5, that is associated with greater declines in total ocean biomass. So what we wanted to do was do similar analyses at the scale of the Bering Sea and look at how management might alleviate some of those climate-driven changes. Each of these global climate models have sort of personality. They're free-running models. There's very, very slight differences in how they might be programmed or the resolution of them that influence the sort of behavior of the models going forward, and that's why they use an ensemble approach to do these projections. So what Al Herman and Wei and Ivan and Karim and Jan did is took those models and looked at their performance in the Bering Sea relative to sea ice, looked for things like, does the model include carbonate dynamics? Does it have nutrient forcings at the boundaries? And then from that suite of potential models, chose, these were all potential models, but chose one that ran warm, one that ran about average, and one that ran cool. And so in the end, we had 3 global climate models that were used to downscale these global models to the region. And we'd love to do more, but it's a real computing hurdle. So it takes a lot of computation, time, and space to do this. And so as our computers get better, we'll probably build out that. But for now, we have these 3 that kind of bracket the range where we think the model's behavior can go. And so from that, then in ACLIM 1.0, we had 2 sort of future trajectories. We had a fossil fuel future, and then we had a moderate mitigation, RCP 4.5 future. And in ACLIM phase 2, we've brought in, through some additional funds, the ability to bring in the latest CMIP 6 projections, which include that fossil fuel scenario, as well as one that's more in line, that's at RCP 2.6 with the Climate Accord. So that's SSP 126. So we have a range of future scenarios in terms of forcing. And then for each of those, we have 3 sort of models that would force the boundary conditions and give us a range of potential future projections. So what Al did is he grabbed the CMIP 5 models. So those were the RCP 4.5 and 8.5, those 3 downscaled models, and used an EOF approach. This is sort of like a spatial temporal PCA to expand back out to bring in the full ensemble of all 35 CMIP 5, or something on the order of 35 CMIP 5 projections. So that's what gives the spread of the different trajectories here. And from that ensemble, they were able to project what the changes in bottom temperature for the Bering Sea would be. You can see it warms considerably to the end of the century. And importantly, we can see that the distribution of that warming is not equal across the Bering Sea. We have increased warming anticipated for the northern Bering Sea relative to the southern Bering Sea, but warming in general across the entire shelf. That model is also coupled to the nutrient phytoplankton zooplankton model. So changes in things like large zooplankton can also be projected. So associated with that warming were projected declines in large zooplankton. And again, the distribution of those declines was not uniform across the shelf, indicating that perhaps the northern Bering Sea might be more productive going forward than the southern Bering Sea, where zooplankton was projected to decline the strongest. We took those projections then and we started coupling them into our biological models. And there's a whole suite of publications that's super exciting right now coming out of ACLIM phase 1 across these biological models. I don't have, it would take maybe days to go through all of them. So I'm going to grab just 2 and we're going to talk about those now. The first one we'll talk about is a climate enhanced size spectrum foodweb model that Jonathan Reum at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center led. And then we'll talk about a multi-species stock assessment model that I lead that was linked to these projections as well. So the first paper is John Reum's 2020 paper. And in this, again, he took those projections, downscaled them, used it to drive a size spectrum model that was linked to climate drivers, and looked at 3 different fishing scenarios and the response of the ecosystem to those fishing scenarios. The key findings from this paper include projected changes in the aggregate biomass declines, I should say, in aggregate biomass. So each of the columns here are different fishing scenarios. So one is status quo, and then slight variation in whether or not the council allocates more towards flatfish or gaddids, but it includes a 2 million ton cap and some of our ecosystem-based measures. What we see is that across the entire size spectrum model, projected declines for catches, spawning biomass, and body weight by end of century under RCP 8.5. But nested within that are species-specific responses. So there are some species that increase, which is shown here in the red circles. In general, the change or the magnitude of decline was greater for the fossil fuel scenario, RCP 8.5, than it was for the moderate mitigation scenario, RCP 4.5. And that's fairly consistent across marine ecosystems. And then finally, I don't have a figure for this, although there's a nice one in the paper. John also evaluated whether or not these effects are additive or if the cumulative effects and response of mortality and growth to temperature were non-additive. And he found that they were non-additive, pointing to the importance of using ecosystem models to understand how climate-driven change may play out in the food web. The other thing that John did in this paper, which is really nice, is he dissected the sources of uncertainty and characterized different species based on those uncertainty sources. And so in this, the light blue is changes in sort of the uncertainty of changes in catch or spawning biomass or mean size due to the nature of the climate coupling. And as you can see that there's certain species like this flatfish complex here that tend to have uncertainty associated as we go forward with how they're reacting to the climate. And there's also an element of that that is driven by just the baseline understandings of the processes and interactions in the system. So directing resources and research towards these two avenues could help us reduce uncertainty in projections. The second one is that a second sort of set of individuals here, species here, were really influenced by these slight changes to management. So these would be candidates that are likely to be strongly responsive to small changes in management. So management may be a good approach for addressing climate change for those species. And then finally, there are a few where there is just inherent noise in the population dynamics, and continued data collection may help us refine that, and continued process studies to understand the source of this noise would be helpful. And then finally, the last sort of take-home message I wanted to point out from this work was that John looked at these three fishing scenarios, again, the status quo and this more gadded and less more flatfish scenarios, and these were modeled through a model called the attach model, which was developed by Alan Haney and Amanda Fegg and was coupled to the size spectrum model. And in those three scenarios, what they found was actually that a slight change by the council to a slight bit of flexibility to allow for up to 10% more flatfish to be allocated under the 2 million ton cap could result in about a 10% increase in catch with very little change to the biomass or the mean body size of the system. So this is sort of a nice win, that some of the climate-driven declines could be attenuated with just a slight change to the flexibility of the management structure without too much impact on the ecosystem. Okay, the second paper that I wanted to talk about was our study that came out over the summer. And in this, we were really focused on looking at how ecosystem-based fisheries management actions in the Bering Sea might play out over time and whether or not they impart resiliency to three species in particular: arrow-toothed flounder, Pacific cod, and walleye pollock in the Bering Sea. And pollock are a huge fishery. Probably heard of them, but they represent close to 40% of annual fisheries by yield in the U.S. It's also an important source of those macronutrients that we were talking about earlier. So what we did is we used a multi-species stock assessment model. Pollock are important prey for species in the food web, including themselves. There's quite a bit of cannibalism. So we used a multi-species model that could account for some of those dynamics through a bioenergetics model. The model also has temperature-specific weighted age parameters and the ability to link recruitment to climate-driven changes and climate covariates. The model has been used operationally as an appendix to the walleye pollock stock assessment. We've been doing that since 2016. It also produces annual mortality indices that have been reported in the ecosystem status report annually for the system, as well as a new project that is driving specific indices called the ESPs for each individual stock. So we've included these operational products from this model. So it's a nice model to include here because it's one that we already have on-ramps to management for. It's also used in a number of different research projects right now. What we did is we took those downscaled projections. We derived annual indices. The model operates on an annual time step and it's non-spatial, although it has the ability for predator and prey overlap indices. We didn't employ those in this analysis, but we did use these annual indices of things like cold pool area, bottom temperature, and zooplankton to project the model forward. Those drove changes in the mortality and growth functions of the model. And then the model was coupled in the annual step. It produces a recommended harvest rate. We set the model to use that harvest rate as catch. So catch equals ABC is one of the scenarios we looked at. We also used one where we used a sloping harvest control rule like they use presently to do management. And there's a lot of details there that I'm not going to get into. And then we also used that sloping harvest control rule will adjust the recommended harvest rate down if the population is below a target. And so we used that adjusted ABC and ran it through a full socioeconomic model, that attached model that I mentioned previously, to evaluate how catch would be allocated based on the 2 million ton cap. So the two contrasting scenarios we'll talk about today are the status quo with and without that 2 million ton cap. So the last two steps in that. What we did is we took these projections of bottom temperature, which you can see here. So again, the left is the moderate mitigation, global carbon mitigation scenario. The right is the fossil fuel scenario. You can see considerable warming is projected for the Bering Sea. The vertical dashed line there is the start of the projection period. The gray line is historical temperatures from the hindcast, and the solid gray line going forward is a control where we just held the climate conditions constant. You can see similarly some of the indices like fall zooplankton, which is an important predictor of overwinter survival and recruitment. You can see that those decline under these projections as well. We took those indices amongst others and used them to drive the populations forward. On the right-hand side is the unfished spawning biomass. So here we just turned off all fishing and said what would the populations do going forward. And we did some random draws around recruitment to get some of those estimates of error. And we can see the kind of take-home message of this is that there's considerable differences between those global climate models. So the degree of variability depends on the models. But also, if you look at the far right column, the set of 3 columns there for pollock, peacock, and arrowtooth, the fossil fuel future scenarios have more consistent declines. And then you can see those relative to that future where we held conditions constant, that scenario where we held conditions constant. The next thing that we looked at in this paper was the relative difference between managed scenarios where we had ecosystem-based fisheries management tools in place, like the 2 million ton cap and the minimum biomass threshold of 20%, versus the same exact setup, but without those pieces in place. And what we found was that those measures stabilized catches for pollock in particular. So a lot of the variability that was introduced to climate was stabilized using the EBFM approach, and that it forestalled decline. So the EBFM here is the thicker line, and in almost every scenario, the same system without EBFM had more variability and tended to crash about a decade earlier than the same system with EBFM. So it forestalled declines. And this could be extremely important window of time to develop measures to help fisheries adapt. So at some point, management can't outmanage climate-driven changes, so these do need to be coupled, according to this analysis, with global carbon mitigation measures. But in the near term, these EBFM measures are extremely important for promoting adaptation in the system. But it is species specific. We didn't see really very little difference. We saw very little difference for peacock between the two scenarios, and that's because Pacific cod is extremely valuable, and it's fished very near its target limit. The other thing that we looked at was the projected changes in risk of decline, 10%, 50%, and 80% decline. And I won't go into too much detail here, except to point out 2 trends that we saw, which is that first, EBFM represents a lower risk approach going forward, and that those risks, the risks of decline do increase over time. And then finally, the other thing we looked at was whether or not there was a critical tipping point in the system, temperature tipping point in the system, which might indicate to us the need to initiate some actions. And what we found is that for pollock and cod, there does appear to be a tipping point of around 2.1 degrees bottom temperature, modeled bottom temperature. Before that, warming of a degree has a little bit of effective declines in catch, but after that, it really does cause rapid declines in catch and biomass. So a degree change before 2.1 degrees is not the same as a degree change after. And we see that 5-year stanzas where temperatures are greater than 2.1 degrees only occurred once historically, but is looking to be commonplace mid-century forward for the system. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to wrap up some of the synthesis findings from ACLIM 1.0, and I'll use the last few minutes to talk about where we're going with 2.0. Firstly, we found downscaling is a necessary step for us. At this point, the global climate models reproduce global atmospheric conditions really well, but at the fine scale needed for fish and fisheries, we still need to do some downscaling. That's important to operationalize to bring this information into stock assessments and management processes. Multiple models of biological and socioeconomic dynamics are needed. We found that contrasting these helped us determine whether or not it was a model-specific response or something synergistic across different models. In general, we are finding that mitigation, global carbon mitigation, is a lower risk. This is, of course, consistent with a lot of findings from other regions across the globe. And finally, we do see that there is scope for adaptation through fisheries management, but they do need to be coupled with global carbon mitigation in order to, they're much more likely to be successful if coupled with global carbon mitigation. So now we've entered into phase 2 of ACLIM. We just kicked it off this last fall. And this very exciting. We're going to be expanding a lot of the social and ecological system risk analyses through expanded management scenarios, expanded social network modeling. We're bringing in spatial distribution modeling, more specifically to all of the biological models, because we've seen in real life redistribution of a lot of the fishery resources to the northern Bering Sea in response to the marine heat waves we've seen in the system. And that was very rapid, what happened within a year, and moved outside of our standard survey area, impacted the kinds of fishing that were allowed because northern Bering Sea has a restriction on bottom trawl gear. So there's a whole series of things that need to be evaluated that we're going to use this project to look at. We also have expanded ocean acidification modeling thanks to Darren Filcher and oxygen modeling, and expanded spawning habitat modeling through collaborations with Lauren Rogers and Ben Laurel, who have an ongoing project that's looking at this. We are also expanding the scope, and I encourage you to read Kelly Kearney's 2020 paper to learn more about the new model, the new ROMS model that has 30 layers and some of the changes that have taken place. And we're working in coordination with a GOA integrated climate modeling project similar to this, so that we can get some understanding and projections of connectivity between the two systems, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. So it's super exciting, and I think that we'll have some real nice insights for management coming out of this. And then finally, I just mentioned that we're expanding our individual base modeling and spatial models to accommodate this. All of this is geared ultimately towards actionable advice, so climate-informed actionable advice for different management entities in the region. And it's itself, the project is itself a test bed for operationalized climate-informed fisheries advice. So this is designed not just to produce some discrete results, which of course we have built in, but also a process for continuing this evaluation going forward so that we can continue to evaluate adaptation, actions, and management advice. It's integrated into the Bering Sea Fisheries Ecosystem Plan, which is super exciting and has been adopted and is rolling out various action modules, including the climate change action module. So there's a lot of potential on-ramps for management, and we're working closely with this group to ensure that our products match those on-ramps. And then multiple individuals in the project are also involved with things like the UN Decade of the Oceans, national climate assessments, regional climate assessments, and the IPCC assessment report. Finally, we coordinate all of this in the North Pacific through through SICME, which is the Strategic Initiative on Climate Change Impacts on Marine Ecosystems. If you're doing integrated modeling in marine environments and you're not yet in this group, please reach out to me or my co-chairs. We'd love to have you involved. We get together once a year or so, compare notes, talk about upcoming project ideas, and help support each other in these integrated modeling endeavors. And so with that, I'll go ahead and wrap up. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Hopefully I didn't go too long. Looks like we got about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Kirstin. Audience, yes, we do have 10 minutes to answer your questions. So please type them in the questions box and I will read them to Kirstin. Also, this is a good time to download the slides that Kirstin mentioned that we have from today's presentation, if you'd like a copy. They're located under the handouts menu on the right side of the screen. Last but not least, I would like to make one plug for the library. Please help us determine the future of the NOAA Library Network by completing our survey, which is active January 6th through the 22nd. If you're a NOAA employee or contractor, go to www.library.noaa.gov, and thank you in advance. And let's see, I think we have a compliment. It says, fantastic presentation. It's always good to get compliments.
Thank you. It is always good. Thank you, especially on virtual presentations where the medium is sometimes challenging. So thank you.
Yes, yes. Sometimes there's a delay, but I encourage you guys to reach out and ask your questions now to Kirstin. And here we go. Here's our first question. Will you create socioeconomic scenarios that link to SSPs? For example, changes in human population and diet preferences, changing market demands?
Yeah, actually, that's a fantastic question. And it doesn't have an easy answer. So it's something that we've been chatting about through ACLIM Phase 1, in particular, Steve Kaspersky, Alan Haney, and there's a growing group of socioeconomic modelers. Amanda Fegg was a postdoc on ACLIM Phase 1, and there's going to be 2 new postdocs. And we're hoping to get, and Sarah Wise, who does social modeling, is now part of it. We're hoping to do this. So there are approaches. Obviously, the global SSPs are important for things like markets around whitefish, which influence whether or not fishers want to harvest particular fish in the Bering Sea. And so it's important to bring those in. And the question is, what's the best approach to doing that? There are where we're kind of going with it right now is thinking about it in 3 different, and I'm hoping I'm paraphrasing Alan and Steve well here, but there's sort of the global scale SSPs, and then there's these North Pacific scenarios. So what within the North Pacific, and they may be nested or they may be independent from those national things. So you imagine that the management entity in the North Pacific may feel that it's important to keep EBF in place, even if there's a global abandonment of EBFM. I hope that's not the case, but those may not be nested exactly. And so one way to do that is to use the global SSPs as scenarios and then overlay the full cross of North Pacific scenarios. And that allows, it does allow for some evaluation of how important the regional scenarios and management actions are relative to these global ones. So how much control is there at the regional level? And so that's the current thinking. I think I've paraphrased it correctly. And those then become the parameters for the model response, the attached model response, and how catches plays out in the projections. It's a great question, though. It's fantastic. And I think if you're doing it differently, please email us, and it'd be a fun discussion. We're hoping to have a workshop around this, and so we could loop you in on that workshop going forward.
Great. Our next question says, very impressive work. Could you speak more about successful approaches to downscaling?
Yeah, so actually there's a couple of different methodologies. I think, I found the work that Al and company did here with the combined EOF and dynamic downscaling approaches is a real promising one. So the 3 core scenarios, 3 core models and the 2 scenarios, so a suite of 6 projections, were derived by taking the boundary edges of the ROMS MPZ model and driving them with those global models. So you can imagine that one pixel of the global model might be encompassing 30 or so edges of that ROMS model. And then the dynamics propagate within the ROMS model based on the way it's programmed. But the other approach is to take statistical relationships between these global conditions and use those to relate the finer scale dynamics. And the EOF approach, which is this sort of space-time PCA, allows for extrapolation based on those dynamic downscaled to the larger suite. So it allows for you have to invest a bit in the infrastructure to do that high resolution modeling for those couple of ones that you downscale, but then you can extrapolate back very quickly to the broader ensemble. And so that was a real nice way to kind of boost the ensemble without having to dynamically downscale 35 different models across 2 different projection scenarios. And so Al's paper and Kelly's work, I should have put their emails up here, but if you email me, I can connect you with them. But their work is cited in the beginning of the talk, and those are, I think, real promising avenues.
Great. Questions are starting to really pour in. This next question asks, I'm supporting our southeastern region, the city of Charleston, for climate change plan, sustainable and resiliency for education and community outreach. Are there any collaboration efforts with implementing the models used in your research with the NOAA Southeastern Mid-Atlantic Ocean Species and Deep Ocean Coral Reef?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know the specifics about integrated projects there. We do have an integrated ecosystem assessment team in the Southeast, and I want to particularly call out that there's a new initiative which a number of us are involved with across NOAA to operationalize, to stabilize support for the physical oceanographic downscaling step of this and linking that to biological. And so we're really scoping partners for that, and that might be if you don't mind sending me an email, I can maybe connect you to folks. But the hope is if we can stabilize, sort of like the Weather Service does with projections and forecasts, stabilize that for the oceanographic environments, then we can start building these tools that are climate informed and climate ready, because we will have regular ability to access that data on a regular basis. So that's the goal. I'm not sure exactly the status of it for the Southeast, and so that would be a good thing to follow up with.
Great.
Great
Next
question.
Yeah. How difficult is it to project forage fish abundance in the different scenarios? It was not included as one of the presented figures, even though forage fish were included in your model analysis.
Yeah, actually, so the size spectrum model that John put together has forage fish in there. Sort of the Bering Sea, the juvenile pollock are an important forage fish component, even though they become later important fishery species as they grow. So that you're right in that I didn't show specifically forage fish, and it is incredibly important. The Bering Sea has an ecosystem biomass threshold of if you get below 20%, it's intended to preserve, especially for pollock, preserve that the new like one in year and younger fish for forage, because it is such an important part of the Bering Sea. And so some of the work that John did with the size spectrum model showed that there's some details about forage fish in there, but one of the things that I found was interesting from his work was that if you include the way that you parameterize and fit to the diet data influences the outcome of the cascades of changes to forage fish. And so it is a really important thing to model carefully and to think about how it's connected to diet data. And his model actually is a size spectrum model that's statistically fit to diet data and showed that that does change the projections for forage fish. So it is important. They're kind of the link between climate and the upper trophic. And they drive a lot of the changes you see here. But yeah, you're right, I didn't specifically talk about them as a group.
This is going to be the last question just because of time. So it asks, what are the largest sources of uncertainty that holds back this type of interdisciplinary science? For example, ROMs, stock assessment surveys, social components.
I would say, I'm going to go with Beth Fulton's title of one of her papers, which is that the people component is probably one of the largest uncertainties. So what are we going to do globally? What are we going to do regionally? And in bringing in social economic modeling, so I think we can characterize the uncertainty with some of the climate drivers and across the spectrum of biological models pretty well. And then understanding how people are going to respond is challenging and vitally important. And so that's the component of this that I, as a biologist, find super fascinating, learning the climate side of it as well as the socioeconomic side of it. But certainly where we're going as a global climate community seems like it changes month to month. And so that for me is personally, in my perspective, the largest source of uncertainty right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time for all the questions. If your question was not addressed today, it will not be ignored. I plan on sending the questions to Kirstin, and she can answer offline. Any last comments, Kirstin or Peg?
Just quickly, thanks. Sorry, thank you, Kirstin.
No.
Wonderful job. Great questions from everyone. I appreciate everyone's participation. Just want to remind folks that we do have another speaker on February 10th. Again, part of Kirstin's team, Steve Arpo, will be focusing in on marine heat waves. So please join us on the 10th, and you'll see more announcements coming out of the NOAA library and through our NOAA lecture series announcements. So thank you so much for joining us, and thanks, Lisa, and to Kirstin and your team. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us and allowing us to share some of our exciting results. I appreciate it.
Great, we're glad to do that.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And to the audience, I appreciate that you joined us today. NOAA Central Library is very proud to present the work of the NOAA community, its partners, and we hope you will join us again for another webinar. So be well all. Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.